Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today's video will be a countdown of the top champions for ranked play in patch 10.19. The meta has been all over the place so far for the start of Set 4, but there's definitely a few standout champions. This of course may change as the meta does shift every few days, and we'll have to see how the 10.20 patch affects things as well. But for now, we've got a good idea of which champions you'll likely see at the top of the meta. Let's jump on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To start off our list, we have Thelios coming in as the number 10 champion. Before we get too far into talking about Thelios, we need to mention who else we considered for the spot. Zed was a contender for being in the top 10 as he's quite good in the current meta as a carry for Shade. And there's quite a few one-cost champions that may have been able to fit in the list, but ultimately we went with Thelios. The reason why is that the meta is shifted towards him again. We haven't seen too much of Thelios since 10.19 went live, but in PvE he was dominating due to Moonlight, Guardian Angel, and attack speed items. But he fell off once Set 4 was released as he got nerfed a few times. Since then he's been on the fringe of the meta where sometimes he'd be played and still do well enough. But mostly there's been a huge shift in the meta using Force Spirit to give a huge boost to your team's attack speed. This shift has opened the door for Thelios to be played more and why he's taken the spot in the top 10. With Guardian Angel, Quicksilver, and Rageblade plus the Spirit buff, Thelios is ridiculously good. The verdict is still out on whether he'll remain in the meta, but for now, he's coming back with the surge of Spirit-focused compositions. And of course, Moonlight, at least in the early game, is generally a strong trait to play. Let's move on to the champion coming in at number 9, Jinx. Jinx takes the 9th spot as the representative for sharpshooters. It's a toss-up between her and Jhin, but given the consistency of sharpshooters in the meta, we have to take our hats off to the sheer amount of crowd control that Jinx can output. Jhin does deserve praise as a carry, but his damage doesn't always make enough of an impact, whereas Jinx is able to constantly stun multiple enemies. The items for Jinx are fairly simple, as you generally want a Rageblade, Shojin, and Quicksilver. There's some variation, but these three will allow her to cast often and not get killed by random crowd control at the start of the fight. Another thing Jinx has going for her is the boost attack speed that Spirit provides on her rather than Jhin. Sure, damage is nice on Jhin, but boosting Jinx towards the attack speed cap is overall more valuable due to her being able to stun more often. That all said, both Jinx and Jhin are important pieces to any sharpshooter comps, so be sure to run both of them. Up next, we have our Mystic representative in the top 10, Zilean. Zilean is coming in at number 8 on today's list. Mystic is insanely valuable in Set 4 as there's a lot of magic damage to worry about. Basically, every composition in the game is going to want at least 2 Mystic in the mid to late game, so we had to have a spot for one of them in the top 10. Most of the Mystics are good, but Zilean really outshines them due to the absurdity of his ability. Being able to essentially give your team free Guardian Angels is ridiculously good. Not to mention they come back with increased attack speed. We do admit that hitting Zilean 2 isn't always that easy to do, and as such, other Mystics are going to be a bit better to go for. But if you're able to find a Zilean, it's generally worth it to slot him in, as his ultimate is just too good to pass up. Like other Mystics, you're often going to use Zilean in any build, but he is useful in the mid-game for a cultist composition if you're lucky enough to find him. For the most part, you're just going to want to use him as your second Mystic. Our next 2 champions for today's list are frontliners. Let's start with the champion coming in at number 7, Atrox. In Set 4, there's a decent amount of choices for your frontline. Brawlers, Vanguards, Elderwoods, and a mix of each, or just random champions like Sedge or Cassiopeia. But there's 2 that really stick out, and that's Atrox and Sejuani. Atrox has a bit less of an overall impact on a fight than Sejuani, but he's still incredibly useful. The biggest reason as to why Atrox is so good for your frontline is that his ultimate basically forces everyone to either run a Quicksilver or Trap Claw for their backline carry. If they don't have it, then they're probably getting pulled or have to position their carry in an awkward place. Essentially, think of Atrox as an improved Blitzcrank. While he doesn't pull instantly, the fact that it's delayed actually works in his favor, as other champions are more likely to move forward and expose the carry. The fact that he changes how players have to position or itemize their carry earns him a spot on the list. But that of course means that the champion coming in at number 6 must be Sejuani. Sejuani is an amazing champion for your frontline. The fact is that her ultimate is always going to get you value, and if you itemize her with defensive items, she can actually cast multiple times in one round. A large AoE stunning ultimate is very hard to pass up, and due to that, she's one of the most contested champions. It does need to be stated that Vanguard isn't as necessary of a trait as it was in Set 3. The reason is that magic damage is just far too common. Even in compositions with more physical damage carries, there's still a ton of magic damage. Sejuani transcends the limits of her traits, which is why she's a great champion. You can fit her in as a standalone champion in most late game comps. All in all, if you're looking for a solid frontline champion, look no further than Sejuani or Atrox. Now we can get into some of the carries of the current meta. Let's start off with Kane as the number 5 champion on today's list. Kane is another 5 cost on today's list, as the legendaries of this set are quite powerful. Not only do they have great abilities, they also have unique aspects that increase their value. In Kane's case, he gets a large power increase after you're able to turn him into either red Kane or blue Kane. That's not the only reason as to why he's a strong late game carry. The simplified version of Kane is that he does a lot of damage. As long as he's able to isolate a target, he's almost always guaranteed to kill them, which makes him a huge threat to backline carries like Ashe or Jhin. In addition to that, he also has a Mana Reaver-like effect from Set 3 that increases the mana cost of a champion ability. So he can jump onto the backline and get his first cast off doing damage and increasing their mana cost. Then the Shade ability can kick in, making him go invisible briefly, which drops the aggro from any units attacking him. At that point, he's likely isolated a unit and will proceed to kill them easily. Basically, if you find Kane, it's almost always worth it to consider buying him, as he provides access to the backline that few other champions do. Next, we have Ashe as the number 4 champion. It may seem like Ashe deserves to be higher on the list, but there's an important reason as to why she's not, and that's flexibility. Ashe is an amazing carry for Brawler Elderwood and is dominating the meta, but she's basically only used in that build. There's some other variations that have cropped up here and there, but for the most part, you're playing Ashe if you have a Brawler frontline with Elderwood sprinkled in. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it just means that the next 3 champions are nearly as strong as Ashe, but also more flexible. With all that said, it's not hard to see that Ashe is one of the strongest carry champions currently. If you can 2-star her and you have a composition built for her, you should almost always play it, and you'll likely top 4 consistently doing so. Riven is up next as the number 3 champion. Riven really exemplifies the theme of the set, and that's playing your strongest board. All you need is 2 or 4 Dusk with Riven, and then you can make practically any composition around her do well. That's just how good both she and Dusk are, not to mention the flexibility you have with items on her. Defensive items work best, but you can sprinkle in some increased spell power or utility like Ionic Spark, and Riven will still be just as effective. At this point in the meta, we can all agree that Riven is an all-around great champion. She's the type of champion you can pivot a composition into and likely still do well with. Moving along, we're into our top 2 champions, and the champion coming in at number 2 is Ahri. Ahri has had a really interesting time in the meta so far. She was never necessarily doing poorly, but wasn't making huge waves in the meta. That is, until players started to figure out how much Force Spirit enables other compositions, how well Ahri does as an AoE damage dealer, and most interesting of all, how well Ahri is as a frontline champion. There's been a few jokes floating around about how Ahri is basically Gangplank in disguise, and, well, it's kinda true. She can output so much AoE damage, and getting her at least 1 cast off is usually all it takes to get an advantage during a fight. And that's where the Spirit buff comes in as well, since she gives a huge boost of attack speed after casting. Just considering the amount of compositions she's enabling along with Spirit is quite fascinating. Shade, Sharpshooter, Thelios, and even just as a standalone carry in Vanguard Mystics, Ahri is likely the most contested champion currently. Keep in mind, if you do want to frontline your Ahri, you have to make a Guardian's Angel. As long as she begins casting the ability prior to the resurrection effect happening, the orb will still be launched and do damage, as well as provide the Spirit buff. And the champion coming in at number 1 on today's list is Sett. Yep, we're sure this is of no surprise, as Sett is a bit overtuned currently. Sett is tanky, heals himself, does a boatload of AoE damage, and after healing himself, he comes back and does true damage? Yeah, he's definitely good and definitely lives up to his moniker, the boss. Sett is the ultimate late game champion, and basically every player aims to have him in their composition. He's highly contested and very difficult to 2-star because of it, but don't fear, even a 1-star Sett is still pretty strong. Not to mention that he can still do well with a huge assortment of items from defensive to utility to damage. If you find yourself struggling in the late game, try adding Sett into your build. Chances are you'll start doing better simply by adding him in, which is why he's our #1 champion for 1019. Alright folks, that is going to be it for our top 10 list, but before we go, we have just a few honorable mentions to cover. First, we do need to acknowledge a few one-cost champions that carry in the current meta. We're talking about Diana, Wukong, and Yasuo. Each one of these one-cost champions, when 3-starred and itemized properly, can carry in their respective builds. While they don't quite make the cut for top 10, they certainly deserve to be recognized as part of the current meta. And our other honorable mention is Zed. We did talk about him briefly when we talked about Thelios, so it's only fair that he gets an honorable mention spot as well. Basically, he's just a strong 2-cost carry that scales well into the late game with Shade, Spirit, and 3-starring him. Alright folks, that's all we've got for you for today. The meta so far has been a bit of a roller coaster as it changes nearly every day, with new builds popping up and slightly older builds returning. This does mean that a list like this is hardly ever static, but at the top end of the list, specifically Sett, Ahri, and Riven, they're likely to remain consistent. Let us know in the comments section below what champions you think deserve to be on the list and what we may have missed. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.